Hi, friends. I hope everyone is keeping well and staying brave out there. I just sent a 17-page letter to some notorious characters in Ontario. Um, I'm be interested to see what kind of response I get, if any whatsoever, or whether or not they'll even read it. But we all have to do what we've got to do, and I was compelled to write this letter. I just wanted to read the third section of my letter that I entitled The Bottom Line. I have worked hard over the past 8 months to understand the events unfolding around us. It started as a search to become familiar with a new virus. I wanted to know what we were being confronted with and how best I could protect my family and friends. I have never been one to follow the leader. I typically am the leader, and it's a responsibility I take very seriously. By collaborating with other leader types, my basis of research expanded and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The only problem was that I wasn't seeing the same picture that most other people were. I was seeing something far more perfidious. As my knowledge and opinions evolved over the course of many hundreds of hours of reading and listening and discussion, and the subjects I explored shifted from viruses and immunity to law, history, finance, and politics, one thing became painfully clear. Our lives were indeed under serious threat, but not from any virus. I cannot claim to be an expert in anything beyond my own person. I have tried so many times to turn away from what's happening, to prepare my home and my family as well as I can, and hope for the best. But time and again, I have been pulled back in. I cannot ignore the suffering that people are enduring. I cannot accept the lies and manipulation that people are being subjected to. And when the health and livelihoods and futures of everyone I know, including my 4 young children, are being thoughtlessly and carelessly sacrificed, and the only explanation offered is that we cannot be the experts of our own selves and must defer that power to nameless, faceless entities instead, I say it is enough. You've gone far enough. The real pandemic we are fighting against is one of pure fear, initiated by corrupt organizations and their wealthy benefactors, strengthened by sloppy science, and propagated by a subversive media. It is a kind of Grimm's fairy tale that nearly everyone has taken up and passed around, even the institutions that we trust in to maintain peace, well-being, and prosperity. Our government, our public health authorities, our community institutions have fallen in step with the narrative and actively promote the story that not only are we all in danger from a deadly virus, but that none of us possess the intelligence or intuition to know what to do about it. As willing participants, you are helping frighten people into obedience while their rights and freedoms are stripped away. Instead of being the pillars of truth and beneficence that the people depend on you to be, your apathy and ignorance are leading them down a dark path from which there may be no return. It's not that I believe there is no virus. Quite the contrary, I believe there are countless viruses, and though I can only speculate as to the origin and intention of SARS-CoV-2, the data very clearly shows that it is not unlike many other viruses that we coexist with every day. As a rule, 10 to 20% of all respiratory infections are caused by coronaviruses, and all can be fatal in a vulnerable subset of people. With a survival rate of 99.9%, even in spite of conflated death statistics and denial of appropriate treatment, COVID-19 is nothing more than a boogeyman being used to scare people. I'm afraid that the prognosis for the plague of panic that we have been steeped in for these many months is not so good. Even if we stopped all the nonsense right now, so many lives are already lost and so many more have been cut short. People will kill themselves. People will starve. People will succumb to disease and mental illness. People will be traumatized. The United Nations has already warned that hundreds of thousands of children will die this year alone, and many tens of millions more will fall into extreme poverty and not have access to adequate nutrition. Small and medium-sized businesses have been devastated. Quality of life has been severely diminished, all because of the measures you have supported. And people still believe you when you tell them it's for their benefit. I am aware that viruses have the ability to cause serious illness in a subset of individuals and that the resultant disease can lead to death. Unlike the virus currently being blamed for so much destruction, this concept is not novel. Sometimes people get sick and sometimes people die, especially those of advanced age already challenged by chronic disease. And each death is a loss that brings grief and deserves dignity. Death is an inevitable part of life, and it is not something we can hide from. Throughout this pandemic, there are some that have legitimately met their end by the failing of their bodies to adapt to the challenge of a virus, as has been the case throughout human history. But it is the failing of our governing bodies that has caused the deaths of so many others. The WHO, our federal and provincial governments, and Public Health Ontario all defiantly maintain that no treatment is currently available to cure or prevent COVID-19. This is patently false. Remdesivir remains the only drug approved for use in severely affected patients in Canada, yet there is hydroxychloroquine, zinc, high-dose vitamin C and D, IV ozone, nebulized hydrogen peroxide, hyperbaric oxygen, inhaled steroids, convalescent plasma, quercetin. There's the Zelenko protocol, the Brownstein protocol, the budesonide protocol, and the Math Plus protocol. Dr. Didier Raoult, who has been successfully treating patients from the beginning with HCQ and azithromycin and educating other practitioners on the protocol, said in March, actually, from all respiratory infections, it's probably the easiest to treat, so there is really no reason to get excited anymore. Professor Dolores Kale claims that high-risk groups can effectively take HCQ and zinc as a preventative. Because of the low risk posed to the general public and because of affordable and readily available treatments and preventatives, Professor Kale claims SARS-CoV-2 should be demoted from a level 3 biohazard to a level 1. Some doctors report cases of COVID-19 that present like cyanide poisoning, high-altitude sickness, decompression sickness, or EMF poisoning. Yet authorities maintain that COVID-19 should be treated exclusively as acute respiratory distress syndrome, and more appropriate treatments are withheld. Since the COVID peak was announced in April, the public has been repeatedly warned and primed to fear the second wave, which is really more of the first wave and definitely delayed. I suspect a second stricter lockdown will be announced any day, even though we have clear evidence that the first lockdown accomplished nothing and did great harm. Despite having months to prepare a more appropriate health response, ensure adequate medical supply availability, and educate the public on how to bolster immunity and improve resiliency to any respiratory virus, the narrative has remained the same. We must wait for a vaccine. Meanwhile, quality of life declines, and I suspect the impending flu season will be one of the worst we've ever seen, not because of COVID-19, but because of what you've done about it. Information about the actual infection and death rates for SARS-CoV-2, as well as effective treatments and preventatives, have been purposefully misconstrued or hidden altogether. Censorship of any information that questions or contradicts the version of COVID-19 that the WHO wishes to portray has been rampant. Doctors, nurses, scientists, epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, economists, psychologists, lawyers, politicians, professors, researchers, all silenced. Dissenters are mocked and ridiculed openly. Many more are afraid to come forward lest their careers and reputations be destroyed. People have been so thoroughly terrified by the version of COVID-19 that you represent that any attempt to bring rational thought back to the situation is treated as the highest form of heresy. In response to the ongoing heavy-handed tyranny coming from our elected and appointed officials, a group of plaintiffs defended by renowned lawyer Rocco Galati have sued the Canadian government, the Ontario government, chief medical officers of health, ministers, and others on the premise of multiple constitutional violations, the failure of Ontario's declaration of an emergency to meet the required legal criteria, and the imposition of measures that are not scientifically nor medically based, pose physical and psychological harm, and are extreme, unwarranted, and unjustified. I highly recommend you read the 191-page statement of claim. Groups like Docs for Open Debate, the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, America's Frontline Doctors, and the COVID-19 Extra Parliamentary Inquiry Committee have formed to challenge the unrelenting adherence to a hopeless script. The subject of COVID-19 was discussed at length at the annual meeting for Doctors for Disaster Preparedness in August. Grassroots protest groups such as Hugs Over Masks, The Line, MAD, and Stand Up Canada have arisen out of desperation for the state of our country and the world. Websites like Evidence Not Fear, Questioning COVID, and Corona Whistleblower are collectives for what has been widely deemed misinformation and therefore rendered practically unsearchable on a platform like Google. If COVID-19 were really what you say it is, you wouldn't have to trick people into believing you. COVID-19 was originally announced as a once-in-a-century pandemic, and modeling experts warned it would rival that of the 1918 influenza pandemic. Perhaps SARS-CoV-2 was designed to be that lethal, but it was made clear from March, and even clearer with each subsequent month of data, that it wasn't. By relying so fervently on the WHO, and by extension Dr. Tam and others, we were only ever given one version of this catastrophe to work with, and most people didn't bother to look any further. Of the deaths that were reported to be of or with or suspected COVID-19, violating all international medical guidelines, appreciable numbers did not show up until after lockdowns were initiated in many countries such as England, France, Italy, and Spain, indicating that any excess deaths noted in the period afterwards may have been contributed to by the lockdowns themselves, many of which were implemented after the viral infections peaked. The reports of 80 to 90% mortality for people intubated on ventilators, and the stories of elderly patients in understaffed, undersupplied nursing homes being denied treatment beyond high-dose sedatives and opioids resulting in death, are held up as proof of how ruthless COVID-19 can be. But the reality, as I believe history will one day recount, is that they are proof of how people were allowed to die, needlessly and alone, because you did not possess the insight or integrity to question the edicts of those that stood to benefit from the prolongation of this pandemic and complete reliance on a new vaccine. So my third and final question that I posed to the readers of this letter is, as I have outlined and as is apparent all around us, we are being subjected to domestic terrorism, crimes against humanity, and murder. My final question is simple. Are you merely incompetent, or are you criminally complicit? It would all make a lot more sense if we were really under attack from a highly contagious and deadly new virus called SARS-CoV-2. But as soon as you pull at that thread, the whole tapestry quickly unravels. There is insufficient proof that SARS-CoV-2 is responsible for the disease known as COVID-19. Koch's postulates have not been satisfied for SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. Pathologists point to a lack of monoclonal antibodies specific for SARS-CoV-2, found in patients with or decedents of COVID-19. There is insufficient proof that SARS-CoV-2 exists as a novel virus. Identifying a new virus requires that virus to be isolated and purified, but multiple access to information requests have returned, indicating no record describing the isolation of any COVID-19 virus, such as SARS-CoV-2, directly from an unadulterated patient sample. Government shall not act with insufficient scientific knowledge if the action has any likelihood of causing more harm than good. The truth will reveal itself in time, and Canadians will know what was done and why. When that time comes, there will be no excuse adequate enough to vindicate those of you who acted willingly against the people, nor those of you who claim to have acted only as puppets and parrots for more heinous characters. I will leave it there. Thank you to anyone who listened to my rantings and ravings. These are words that I really needed to express things that are on my heart and my mind, and I'm just trying to put the ripples out there like so many other people are working so hard to do right now in any way that I can, that perhaps will create the tide of change in all of this. I really believe that we are. But I'll leave it at that. Lots of love to you all. Thanks very much.